Click subscribe.
He-Man is not an original name. It was used even as far back as the early 1950s for the Ziff Davis comic line that was edited by Superman co-creator Jerry Siegel. However, this name was not successful at that time in that particular form of use and became very culturally successful when Mattel used it for the toy line of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. One of the key factors in its success was that there were mini comics and picture books that were made for the toy line that would provide much needed backstory for Generation X kids to enjoy before video games became mainstream. So let's go ahead and go through a fun timeline of the picture and comic books of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe in the 1980s. Mark Taylor is the visual designer and illustrator for the He-Man character that was used in its heyday from 1982 to 1987. He said that his influences were Prince Valiant from the late 1930s, created by Hal Foster, as well as the EC Comics Tales from the Crypt stories from the early 1950s, and of course Frank Frazetta's Conan paintings of the 1970s. Donald Glut and Alfredo Alcala worked on the Conan magazine comics from the 1970s, which made them perfect for the He-Man mini comics, specifically the first 4 that were released with the toy line in 1981. You can see here that this was before Prince Adam and before King Randor of Eternia. He-Man was originally part of a post-apocalyptic nomadic tribe, and he just happened to be the greatest physical specimen of this tribe. Fun backstory is that Conan Properties International sued Mattel over He-Man's similarity to Conan, and that lawsuit went nowhere. After the He-Man mini-comics were released in 1981, DC Comics had a license to work on the He-Man character as well. First one was DC Comics Presents 47 in 1982, and this was by Paul Kupperberg and Kurt Swan. What makes these interesting is that these visuals and stories are very much aligned with the Donald Glut Alfredo Alcala mini-comics, but with more of the Prince Valiant side with a yet-to-be pink cartooned Prince Adam. Man-at-Arms doesn't have a mustache yet, and the speech patterns of Eternians very much mimic a King Arthur-type dialogue. He-Man also does not have a power sword yet, and instead, as an already strong Prince Adam runs into the Sorceress's power cave to put on the empowering He-Man devices that comprise his outfit. Skeletor has the purple half of the power sword, with the other half not yet discovered by anyone on Eternia. This is an interesting pre-Filmation He-Man, which oddly enough answers pretty quickly who would win in a fight between He-Man and Superman. And DC Comics Presents 51 1982, with art by Kurt Swan and Dave Hunt, also written by Paul Kupperberg, continues the story from issue 47. The cover art to this preview story is loads of fun, with the classic pre-Filmation aesthetic with an Arthurian-type flag showing it is a bit advanced from the initial 4 mini-comics. However, it is still very much grounded with merman scenes that harken to the adventures shown in those mini-comics a year earlier. Zodak premieres as a Kirby-like Metron-type figure following the stars and signs to minimize the impact of Skeletor's evil, and in this continuity it was Superman who brought the other half of the power sword from Earth only to be lost again. Prince Adam is shown as a Bruce Wayne playboy rather than a klutzy-type Clark Kent like he was in the comics. When Mattel contracted Mark Taylor to draft the He-Man character, there was also a corporate directive to very much be inspired or influenced by the Frank Frazetta Conan that was very popular in the 1970s, notably from the 1976 Conan the Conqueror cover art. Now, George Tuska and Alfredo Alcala would summon this in the interior splash page of DC's Masters of the Universe 1, 1982. Masters of the Universe 1, 1982 is a continuation of the 2 DC Comics Present stories of 47 and 51 that were present earlier that same year. Again, what makes this miniseries fun is that it is pre-Filmation, so He-Man is more of an adult barbarian story with the Arthurian influence in his Prince Adam persona. Even Prince Adam again is a blue-clad playboy rather than the pink klutz from the cartoon. George Tuska and Alfredo Alcala provide some very strong art considering it's just a licensed product, and it works well since Alcala drew the first 4 mini-comics a year earlier. The backstory of He-Man's mother, the Queen, being from Earth is established very quickly here. Masters of the Universe 2, 1982 also has some really strong art by George Tuska and Alfredo Alcala, and in this one it shows He-Man, Man-at-Arms, Teela, and Stratos about to dive deep into the ocean to wage war on Merman and his lair of the Merpeople. Merman routinely refers to his pagan god, Serpos. DC Masters of the Universe 3, 1983 shows Skeletor empowered by both halves of the Power Sword, and he is within the interiors of Castle Grayskull. Unfortunately, this final issue of DC's pre-Filmation run did not have the inks of Alcala to give it that grounding into the mini-comics with that barbarian look that he brought to Conan in the 1970s. The Klaus Johnson inks on the cover are interesting, however, because this was around the time when he was inking Frank Miller on Daredevil. 1983 was a big year for He-Man, especially because of the release of the Filmation cartoon. And really around this time there were so many strong visuals that there were even more comics and picture books to follow. Check out this hardcover comic book, which also sports an Earl Norem cover with a story by Roger McKenzie illustrated by Adrian Gonzalez and Fred Carrillo. Similar to Giant Size X-Men 1, 1975, the team splits up into various chapters, each with their own locale, until the final battle at the end united as the various Masters of the Universe. There were 12 great He-Man picture books from 1983 to 1986, with awesome covers illustrated by the fantastic Earl Norem. These were produced by Golden Books. A couple covers were done by Gino D'Achille. Roger McKenzie wrote a couple of these memorable stories, and Al McWilliams illustrated a couple. These are scans of covers from my childhood collection. The first 4 are really the original He-Man, where you really have just a few of the characters as far as heroes and villains. There's a dry planet, and then there's Castle Grayskull. And that's all we really knew about early He-Man. The success of the TV show built up, there were more colorful covers to follow. One of Bruce Timm's earliest penciling work in comics was the introduction of Hordak in 1984. You could see that he was not yet from Etheria, nor was he a She-Ra antagonist, because this was a year before She-Ra. He was from the Fright Zone, and he was both an antagonist to He-Man as well as Skeletor. Now, Bruce Timm also created this beautiful He-Man piece in 1985. This was a half a decade before his work on Batman the Animated Series. Even Rocketeer artist Dave Stevens made He-Man art for Mattel's toy packaging circa 1985. Later in 1985, Mattel has toy fans submit their own character designs for the Masters of the Universe toy line, and kids were asked to call with their vote. Timm actually redrew the designs for this ad. Fearless Photog, the character on the left, was the winner. Not a comic book, but definitely a picture book. Golden Books put out 6 Masters of the Universe picture books written by Bryce Corr and illustrated by Harry J. Quinn and James Holloway, with creative and design direction by Jacqueline A. Lloyd and Ralph E. Eckerstrom. These were put out by Western Publishing in 1985 with an intro that centers on Queen Marlena's arrival to Eternia from Earth. So you can see that He-Man's mother being from Earth and an astronaut comes up as a big deal in various media. Many of us know about the New Universe line of comics from Marvel Comics, but there is also another line of comics around this time, and that was Star Comics made for kids. Star Comics ran a licensed Masters of the Universe series from 1986 to 1987, penciled by Ron Wilson and written by Mike Carlin. This series was post-Filmation, and so the content wasn't nearly as hard-hitting as the 1982 DC series, but did have some nostalgic imagery like the slime pit. This is funny because Mattel had to pay out damages to parents suing for money to change their carpets after staining from this product. The other interesting cover was issue 4, which had Hordak surrounded by a frame of Marvel characters like other comics from that month of November 1986, celebrating Marvel's 25-year anniversary. Now, the 1987 to 1991 He-Man newspaper comic strip started out as a coalition of talent from both Filmation and Mattel, which started and came together toward the end of the He-Man cartoon and the beginning of the She-Ra cartoon. For the most part, it was written by husband and wife team Chris Webber, and Karen Wilson was the editor, and drawn by Gerald Fortin. Connie Shore colored the Sundays. It was popular globally until 2 years into its run, when it was dropped in the USA from lack of popularity, but continued in Europe and South America. It is seen as continuing the story from the animated cartoon, which goes into an aging man-at-arms who meets his love and gets engaged to be married. Prince Adam better understands the boring responsibility of training to become a king, and there is a budding romance between Teela and He-Man, who actually kiss. There is some exploration into Castle Grayskull, and it delves further into the discovery of King Hiss of the Snake Men and the inner workings of Snake Mountain. Interviews with the writer-editor team show that Mattel had to approve every script submitted by Filmation creative team on these strips. Now, is this an episode of Caged Meat? No. It's a daily from the 1987 He-Man newspaper strip, when Mosquito throws a muscular prisoner on the ground and gives a good drain. You could see that this happens with He-Man as well, and the poor unfortunate Mosquito says that he feels like his head is going to explode. These are one of those panels you just never forget. Now, here's a funny connection between 1987 Spaceballs Prince Valium as a variant off of Prince Valiant, just as Prince Adam was. And oddly enough, doesn't that make the two blonde princes as creative offspring and brothers? Masters of the Universe 13, 1988 is the final Marvel Star comic that truly ends with a bang. Prince Adam travels to the future and finds that Eternia is under rule by Skeletor, with Man-at-Arms murdered, Teela cold and jaded, as the new sorceress, with his older self as an angry freedom fighter. With only one sword of power, He-Man and his older self hold up the sword and both become He-Man. The older He-Man fights the older despot Skeletor to the death, with Castle Grayskull crumbling, and the lyrics to the cataclysmic page surprisingly paces well with the drama. The last panel ends with a bang, and you can see that we get this similar look in the final scene of the 1987 Masters of the Universe film with Dolph Lundgren. And this was a true crossroads where a lot of creative people were putting out a lot of great product. It's important to know that He-Man has as much of a comic history as it has a toy history.
Click, subscribe.